The entrance. Kia ora koutou, ko Giacomo Calefi toku ingoa. Ka mihi atu au ki te maunga o Taranaki, ka mihi atu au ki te mana whenua o tēnei wahi. Kei te whanganui a Tara toku kāinga, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Giacomo Calefi. As you might tell from the accent, I'm not quite from around here, but I've been living in New Zealand for 7 years now. I live in Wellington. So I'm here today I'm representing the Taranaki Offshore Partnership, which is a company that is investigating the possibility of building offshore wind farms in New Zealand. So before we start, let's say that what we're talking about today is we're having a question and answers session. We're not talking about a project that will be built. We're talking about a project that we are bringing in an opportunity, what we think is an opportunity to the country, and we are here to discuss all together for a number of years whether this is a good idea or not. So the idea here is that we're meeting to start talking about what offshore wind is, which is the number one step, because a lot of people don't quite know what this technology represents. And that is, for us, the first step to engaging with the community. We need to hear your views about whether this is the right type of project for New Zealand. It's a really big scale project, as you might see some of the components around. So it's a sort of a national scale project, but there's definitely a big component which is quite regional. Like it would be a South Taranaki project, and that's why we set up this space in Hawera, because we wanted to be close to you guys and the local community, because that's the level at which this discussion has to happen, besides the government level and so on. So just wanted to clarify where we're sort of coming from. So I hope it can be a friendly, informal discussion. Jump in with questions. As you can imagine, when we talk about these projects, there are a lot of questions around. So what I did is all the slides I'm going to run through try to answer all this bunch of questions, which is normally the type of questions that we get asked when we go out there. So I'm not asking you to read through the whole thing, but just to say, hopefully most of the questions that you have might pop up throughout the presentation. But feel free to jump in, ask, and we'll have a good conversation. Shall we start with who is Taranaki Offshore Partnership, which is probably a good thing. I won't talk too much about the project specifically that we're talking about. Tonight it's more about this kind of offshore wind 101. So what is offshore wind? There will be some references to the project, but there's quite a lot of information in this brochure about what we're proposing. So the partnership is a partnership of two companies. One is the New Zealand Super Fund, which you might have heard of. It's sort of the entity set up by government a few years ago that is basically tasked with investing cleverly, hopefully, money in big projects in order to make a return so that they can basically pay our pensions in the future. CIP, the company that I work for, is a Danish company that is a fund management company. So they manage funds from mostly institutional investors, so like pension funds and so on. It's a company that has built a lot of offshore wind around the world. And that's sort of what we specialize in. So we look at new markets, we look at new countries where offshore wind hasn't happened yet, and we ask the question, is this the right thing? So we do all the kind of technical studies to identify if there's a good resource. And then the next step is, again, discussing whether this resource should be used for this. Let's start from the very, very, very beginning. Maybe most of you know this, but what is a wind turbine? How does it work? I'm assuming most have an idea. So we're talking about wind hitting a big windmill thingy, turning an axis, turning a shaft that turns a generator and that produces electricity. So it's just a way of taking the wind that hits the blades. Blades are pretty much the same as a wing of a plane. They operate in the same way. And so the wind hitting them makes the rotor turn and we generate electricity. So you probably see them when you go down to Waverley. That's one of the closest places. Nothing, but I mean, the concept of using wind energy has been around for thousands of years, right? This is just using it for electricity and not grinding food, for example. Any questions on how wind turbines work?
What was that, sorry?
Any questions on how they work? Or would you like to know more? I think.
What are you guys going to have to use? And I mean, not vegetable oil. I know you guys aren't going to use that. But how much oil are we going to need to run these things?
They don't run on oil.
They run on
the wind makes the.
Oil at all?
I think there is a little bit of oil in the gearbox to keep it lubricated.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, that's it. It doesn't.
So that will you use every year per
I think it's
turbine?
I think it's,
Is it 80 gallons?
I don't know the number. I could look it up, but it's something that doesn't get replaced that often, to be honest. It's a very small component. It's not, there's no oil spills from these things. Yeah.
I want to know something.
Yep.
You mentioned at the beginning of the your spiel that there were two fund managers, one New Zealand and one overseas.
Correct. Yes.
Correct?
Yep.
What is the percentage of the return on the New Zealand one against the overseas one?
Yeah. At the moment, it's a 50-50 joint venture. So the returns will be 50% each.
Well, why is it 50-50? Because the main plant it over in Denmark.
The what? Sorry.
It's not Copenhagen where.
Yeah.
So why are they getting 50% of what our natural energy over here?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's the way it's being set up. So if the super fund wanted to go 100%, that could be a thing. The thing is, it requires a lot of expertise to build these, and at the moment, no company in New Zealand has the expertise to build this kind of thing. So the natural way of doing it would be having a partnership with someone who can build them. And then, when New Zealand becomes experienced at doing it, then absolutely we should be doing it ourselves.
If it gets off the ground.
Yeah, of course. that will be the theme throughout the whole night. Just a couple of things that I find very cool about this. I'm an engineer, by the way, by background, so I get quite excited about these. The turbine obviously turns around to face into the wind, which is something that not everybody knows, but it understands where the wind is coming from and it turns around in order to be always facing it. And also the other thing is that each blade can basically turn on its axis, if it makes sense, in order to always be sort of pitched into the wind to capture it as much as well as it can. So they're pretty clever machines, these things. And again, as an engineer, I like the idea. So, okay, that's wind turbines, and you know what they look like in Waverley, for example. So when we talk about offshore wind energy, it's basically taking those, same concept, and putting them in the sea. Now, soon there's going to be a slide on why we put them in the sea. But just as an idea, this is what an offshore wind farm would look like. So I made a bit of these lines are made by me a bit just to give the idea. But so we have wind turbines, same thing as we just discussed. They would be connected by underwater cables. So there's cables running in between, and then all these cables converge into you can't really see it here, but there's a platform that looks a bit like the oil and gas platforms. And it's called an offshore substation. All that does is sort of collect the electricity all in one place, and then that can be sent to shore in one or two cables. So that's pretty much how it works. It's the same concept as the ones that you see on land, but it's in the water. As simple as that.
Are the cables laid on the ground, or will they be buried?
They could be either. I will have a slide on that as well. They can be laid on the ground, so they can just be sitting on the seabed. That's a possibility. If you want to protect them more, because they're quite fragile, you can trench them 1.5 to 2 meters underground. So basically make a trench and then cover it up, and they just sit, and that way they're protected. They're a bit more protected. That depends a lot on how mobile the seabed is. We know that South Taranaki Bight has quite big sand waves going through. So the level of the seabed is changing all the time. So that begs the question, does it make any sense trenching it? Because maybe a year later it's uncovered. So certainly a question that the engineers will have to work on. Yep.
So with the amount of turbines in our water,
Yep.
we know it's going to cause some sort of electromagnetic in the water due to the fact that we've got electricity running through our water. How is that going to affect our marine life on the South Taranaki Bight?
Yeah, that's interesting.
We get a lot of our kai from that area.
Yep.
So that's really important to us Indigenous people, and even those that love that sort of stuff as well.
Sure.
How is that going to affect us?
Yep, that's one of the things that is actually starting to be studied at the moment. There's no evidence at the moment that electromagnetic currents have any impact on the environment, but it is quite of a new field. So it's something that I know more offshore wind farms that have been built are starting to study. If those cables are actually,
What studies have been done yet?
I think they have been. They're starting to do some studies, and yeah, so that's something that we would keep an eye on. That would be probably something that potentially could.
There for quite a while, mate.
Sorry.
That building that there would stop the marine life out of here.
We're here to try and make sure that we do it in a way that it does exactly not that.
Explanation saying that it won't.
Well, we're trying to start the conversation not from there.
Out there, that kai there belongs to us. You go put an asset out there, mate, you're going to chase all our kai away.
Years
This
ago,
is
we
not-
had trawlers out here.
Anyway, who gives the permission to let you fellas go ahead if it does go ahead? Who's the final spokesperson to this? I'd like to meet them.
Yeah, well, there will be quite a few. There will be a few
Quite a few what?
a few groups that will have to agree.
Quite a few people
And-
who are going to guarantee this.
And certainly iwi will be, iwi, hapu, and all you guys will be one of the voices that will have to confirm whether this should go ahead or not.
So it would be a voice but not an investor.
Uh,
That would be the people.
we're proposing an opportunity, as I said. Then we have to decide.
It's your
Sorry?
opportunity. You're not proposing an opportunity to us.
It's also proposed to you, yeah.
Bullshit.
Well, I'm hoping that other people see that maybe we're trying to do it. By the way, we know very well that big corporations haven't exactly been very good to South Taranaki in the past, or to New Zealand in general. We're trying to do it differently, and we're trying to come here honestly, and we hope that you see that. More than that, there's not that much more that we can do. So this is the idea of this place is to exactly have these conversations.
We built big projects here in the past
Yep.
for New Zealanders, and the government sold them off. They
Yep.
sold them off to private investors,
Yep.
That's what happened.
and now they've shut them down or they've converted them.
Yep.
I worked in the construction at Mohanui when that was going on.
Yep.
And we could have produced the fuel that came out of there, the synthetic fuel that we were producing, we could have produced that for 20 to 30 cents a litre.
Yep.
The government, forced by the petrochemical companies, joint venture petrochemical companies, that had to go to the refinery purely to have perfume put in.
Oh yeah.
And all of a sudden it was $1.10 a litre.
Yep.
And we could have done that at the gate
Yeah. Yeah.
up there.
I'm
We
not.
used to take that fuel home and put it in our boats.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
the vehicles off the gate there, the testing fuel they took off.
Yep. So
And there was nothing wrong with it.
as I'm saying, I understand that there's a past and a history of things not done properly. We're here to try and do things a little bit differently from the start. Again, we're years away from even thinking about building this, and that's why we want to have these conversations early on to hear exactly these comments and to give the explanation that we can give. Yes.
Hi.
Hey.
Have you got any in Copenhagen that you've built or like offshore that have got the studies gone through about the wildlife and stuff like that so far that we can
Like
compare
the
with?
habitat.
Yeah, we have quite a lot.
Or the electromagnetic current?
Yeah, the next session in a month's time will be focused on the environmental aspects. So today today is an overview of a bit everything. So I will touch on a lot of things that you might want to hear more about. The next 3 sessions are 1, environmental aspects. The second is job opportunities, and the third will be iwi and community benefits. So the idea is to focus a lot more on those topics today is more of a general overview, if that makes sense.
Well, I'm going to actually ask the question of the positioning of this particular part. I'm looking on the actual part. I know we haven't got to the full program yet.
Yep.
But why have you picked to actually go right over the top of the Maui gas field?
Of the Kupe gas
That
field.
seems rather strange.
Now, I'll get to it, if that's okay. I have a slide on that. Yeah.
I didn't see it in the list.
Yeah. All good. Sorry. What is offshore wind? Okay, so we all good with what we're talking about, at least? Great. So I keep using the word megawatt, and I realize that a lot of people might not have any idea what a megawatt is. So I thought just to give it's a measure of how much power can be generated. You might be familiar with this. I know I have 3 in my house. So it's just I found it on the Mitre 10 website. It's a heater. It's a 1 kilowatt heater. So 1 megawatt is enough power to run 1,000 of these. Just to give an idea of what it is, because I know that it's a word that a lot of people are like, what does that mean? Just a quick history of offshore wind, and this is a very quick one, just to say this is a technology that is new to New Zealand because we don't have any installed, but it's been around for quite a while. So it was kind of invented in Denmark, as in invented meant they were the first ones to actually put wind turbines in the sea. That's in 1991, the Vindebø offshore wind farm, pretty tiny turbines for the time, but it was the first time that they were actually put out in the sea. Hans Rev in 2002 was the first time that you had serious bigger turbines generating enough power that it became sort of comparable to a normal power plant, like the ones that you see on land. And in 2017 in Scotland, High Wind was the first floating offshore wind farm. So you can't see it here, but this is actually floating. So this turbine is floating. So that was quite a big step change in how this technology worked.
Did they have cables between them?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so the question that we often get is, we're perfectly familiar with the turbines built on the hills around here and Palmy and in Waverley as well, but why build them, why put them in the sea? What's the point in that? These are probably the 5 main aspects that we talk about that for which it makes sense to build at sea. One is, anyone out there who goes fishing probably knows that it's always windy, right? Winds tend to be a lot more constant and strong out at sea than on land, just because on land you get all the sort of impact from, I don't know, hills or just houses and things like that. So it's a lot more turbulent on land. Whereas out in the sea, there's just better wind resource. That leads to higher capacity factors, and that's a bit of a technical term just to say it allows the turbines to work better, to be more efficient than the ones on land, just because, again, the wind is more constant. It is easier to transport components. By the way, can you all read? Because you guys are all at the back, but if anyone struggles, plenty of place in the front. Yeah, easier to transport components, and the reason for that is that you probably know that the turbines built onshore, some of the blades, sometimes they have to transport them through countryside, and pretty tricky to get a 70-meter blade to go through sort of hills and stuff like that. So there's kind of a natural limit of how big these things can be if you want to transport them around on the countryside. Whereas if we're in the sea, then we can pretty much go as big as we want. These components normally get built right next to the harbor, to the port, and then they go straight onto an installation vessel and out at sea. So we're a lot less constrained by just the topography of the terrain. And building bigger turbines means that we can get a lot more efficiency and just a much better power plant. So that's the idea. We get a lot more electricity out of an offshore wind farm than an equivalent onshore wind farm, if that makes sense. Limited visual impact, where for our project, we're talking about the closest turbines to land would be 25 kilometers offshore. So I do have a slide coming up, but with a bit of an idea of what that means in terms of visual impact. You would see them really, really tiny on the horizon on a clear day, but yeah, would be different. You certainly wouldn't see the ones further out. And certainly in Europe, that has been a big reason for moving offshore. A lot of people were a bit tired of seeing enormous wind turbines in their backyard. So if you don't like the ones in Waverley, understandable. Some people don't like them. Some people like to see them. These will be the visual impact will be very different for these. We're really tiny on the horizon. And the 5th point is just that these projects are just a much larger scale than onshore wind, so they require a lot more resources. They just generate a lot more opportunity for the economy. For example, they use a lot more workers than an onshore wind farm. Onshore wind farm, once it's built, you might have 3 technicians maintaining it. Something like this requires many more, like tens of technicians. And most of the time they can be sourced locally. So it's a good sort of economic story as well.
Excuse me, Jack.
Yes.
Just looking at some of these turbines, even with the pictures that you've got on.
Sure.
Give me an object of how big these things are. I mean, I haven't actually seen one up close, but give me an object that is the same.
Unfortunately, we're a bit covered there, but can you see that there's the
Sky Tower.
That's the Sky Tower?
That's like nearly a 747 Boeing.
It's bigger than a 747, yeah, I think.
Massive.
That's massive.
Yeah. So the top of the blades would be taller than the Sky Tower in Auckland. And back there we also have the wind wand down in the corner.
Because they're only going to last for 20 to 25 years, well, that's the expiry date. Where are we going to put these things? Are they just going to fall over and water?
Hopefully not. That would be designed very badly. No, they all get removed. I have a slide on just that. So 90% of the whole thing is recyclable, and what the turbine manufacturers are working a lot now on is making the blades recyclable. That's the last bit that up until recently was not easy to recycle.
So these are all recyclable?
Yes, yeah. Most of it is steel, and steel is very easy to recycle.
Ones that are coming to Taranaki, are those going to be recyclable? Because I know there is
Yep.
some that aren't recyclable. And
All-
they're burying them in other places.
Yeah,
And
that's been the way of doing it up to now, and nobody was happy about that. Not even us developers. That's not the way to do it.
here in Taranaki.
No, for sure. So the idea is that these recyclable blades are pretty much the focus of a lot of developers at the moment, because that kind of solves pretty much everything. They become almost entirely recyclable. So, yeah.
So, how many tons in just one installation?
The foundations can be around 2,500 tons. The tower plus the turbines might be another 1,000 tons. So there's quite a lot of steel in there.
They don't last forever, do they? No, they don't last
Yep.
forever. They have to be maintained.
Yeah.
Who comes to maintain them? The owners, you guys?
I have a slide on that as well.
They're huge.
Yeah.
And if we end up taking over and we get an investment in there, that means we're going to be owners and we're going to have to maintain them. But given that if we might get 8,000 per whichever one you got, that's still not enough for us to maintain this stuff and
No.
to keep our ecosystem clean.
Yeah. There's a lot of work required, for sure. That's why there's a lot of work required. That's why we're figuring out how to do it. You know, there's a whole operations and maintenance strategy on how to maintain them. They don't need as much maintenance as you would think. So like the whole steel part just lives 35 years by itself. The turbine itself needs regular maintenance, but that means like once a year. If you don't mind, Virginie, we'll talk about that. Is that okay? Because I have quite a few slides and just trying to get to the end. We might not make it to the end, but we'll see. So the question, why South Taranaki, and why we're looking at here, and why around the Cooper gas platform, which is a good idea. That slide that you see on the left-hand side is that image is from the World Wind Atlas, which kind of looks at the wind speeds around the world, where we have good wind resource. And you can see that in New Zealand, this color here is 10 meters per second wind, and that's pretty much the kind of maximum that scale goes to, because it's considered exceptional wind resource. So, and you can see that South Taranaki, as you know, I don't need to tell you, but because of the Cook Strait effect, right, we have really good wind here funneling through Cook Strait. So that's the number one thing that a wind developer would look at. There's really good wind. And the number two thing is that here I have the two lines that are, one is the 12 nautical miles limit. You might know that there's it's different jurisdictions in a way, inside and outside. And outside, this is the 60 meters water depth contour. So here, deeper water, and here, shallower water. This space here is shallow enough to install these turbines connected to the seabed. And that makes it a lot easier to do. It's actually the only way that we can do it right now, because floating offshore wind that I was talking about earlier will happen in the future, but the technology is not quite there, getting there, but not quite there. So basically, here we're saying the water is shallow enough that we can install to the seabed, and we have amazing wind conditions. So those are the two sort of first steps to go like, well, at least we should, we can look into, is this a worthy thing to consider? And yes, we know about the Cooper platform. It's located roughly around here. The size of project that we would be looking at is something like that or something like that. So we can be either side of the platform. There's no particular restriction.
Of course, is much larger underneath.
Sorry?
But the field,
Yep.
the actual gas resource
Yep.
is much bigger
Yep.
underneath. So you're sitting right over the top of it.
Yeah, it's not that much bigger. It's sort of like this. So there's still plenty of space left. We're looking outside those areas.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So there's not a lot of space in general compared to other countries where there's maybe a lot of this combination of good wind and shallow seabed. Here we're a bit restricted, but again, we are in the feasibility stage. We don't know if this is going to happen at all. We're looking into all the technical parameters, the social parameters. Does all that stuff make sense? It takes years to make the decision. So
I'm rather surprised that you've done the feasibility study on the winds and the directions and the forces that is produced, but you've done nothing about the ecosystem.
I know.
That bothers me.
No, we've done it.
You've got recreational fishermen that go out there. So I'm a bit puzzled as to why that hasn't been yanked up to be up front as much as how you're going to generate your power.
Yeah, but we've done environmental studies as well. And I will talk about those a little bit more, if that's okay.
Well, there's a lot of talking about, but no doing.
Yeah, no, I'm saying we have done some. I'm saying we have done environmental studies.
Seismic, as far as the actual wind is concerned, that's global, that's easy.
Yeah, no, but it goes back to what he said over there. You know, it all starts off nice and very airy, but as the time goes on, everything just gets walked over.
Well,
There has been issues that...
well, we're trying to not do that. By the way, we know about the seabed mining stuff, right? So that was our initial. Part of this is also to try and clarify that we're trying to not do things like that. And, you know, I'm here to tell you, and I hope that you believe me. But if you don't believe me, there's only so much I can do. We're trying to do things better. We're trying to have these conversations early. We're trying to be honest and open about everything. And we're hoping that it will be that kind of conversation, right? Hello.
Do the turbines reach a cut-off point
Yeah.
when the winds are accelerated?
Great question. Yes. There's a cut-in wind speed.
Hurricanes.
So they start turning at around 3 meters per second, which is actually quite low. It's like a bit of a breeze. And they cut off at around 30 meters per second, which is 100 kilometers an hour. So it's strong.
0 or 1-3?
30, yes. 30. So yeah, beyond that, they could still spin, but they would be spinning so fast that it just becomes structurally difficult.
So,
So-
what happens when it's not spinning?
It just stays there. Yeah, it's not producing electricity. Yeah.
Maintenance.
You're going to need maintenance.
No. If it's not spinning because there's no wind, it's just not. There's no resource there. Yeah. So, but again, that's the reason for going offshore. It's quite rare that there is zero wind offshore. So yeah.
How long does the braking system last on it if we have to start replacing them?
The braking system is actually quite clever because the first way of braking it is, you know how I was saying earlier that the blades turn? So the blades turn into the wind so that the wind is now not trying to make it turn. And at that point, the mechanical brake doesn't need to act that, you know, it's not like there's a big clamp that has to stop an enormous thing turning. It's once it's stopped because of the blades are feathered into the wind, then there's not that much force. But the braking system, you certainly don't want that to break. There was one video on YouTube, which if you want you can go and see. It's from onshore wind many years ago. A turbine clearly not designed very well, and the brake broke during a storm, and you see the wind turbine spinning out of control. So that's not what we want, and nobody wants that.
So do they last for 25, 35 years? Or
Absolutely. Yeah, everything. So going out and doing maintenance on these things is extremely expensive. So a lot of the design goes into making sure that they can survive the 30, 35 years without major maintenance. And then every now and then you have issues that come up and you have to fix them. But can I jump to the next? Okay, so this is a render. It's not South Taranaki coast, as you can know, as otherwise it would have to be black sand. This is just to give an idea of what a 25 kilometers away offshore wind farm looks like on a clear day. And you probably have to come here to see them. So it's there. So is it visible? Yes, but it's really tiny on the horizon. It's really different from, Waverley. So this is a question that we get all the time. We will be doing visual renderings, sort of showing what it would look like from Pattaya, for example. But it will be a similar view. But that's the kind of thing that we will be producing in the future, and you will be seeing it, and you will, be able to form your view over this, whether this is a good idea or not. Shall I jump ahead? So these are really big projects. They take a long time to, first of all, go through this whole feasibility and development stage. So again, deciding whether we should build it, whether it makes sense to build it. 3 to 5 years is quite optimistic, and that's normally in a market that is already has offshore wind. In New Zealand, we're kind of starting from scratch. We have no laws that allow anything like this to be built. There's a lot of conversations to be had for people to understand what it is. So we're looking more at 7 years. We're looking towards the end of the decade to the point where we have enough information to decide, is this worth going ahead with? So plenty of years to discuss, plenty of years to ask questions and hopefully give answers. Once we have all the approvals and licenses, that's the point where a project like this would go ahead and actually be built. It would take a couple of years to actually build it. Operations and maintenance, it would run for 30-35 years. That's normally what we look at nowadays. It keeps getting longer. When I first started in the industry 12 years ago, it was 20 years. And the main reason, let's see who can guess what the main reason for 20 years was. What was the limiting factor that allowed only 20 years of life on these turbines. No, steel is fine. Generator was okay. It was a paint. It was a corrosion paint. There were no sort of companies in the world that would guarantee corrosion paint that would last more than 20 years. And so at that point, at the end, you were risking corrosion that was out of control. But as that gets developed better and better, we're now looking at 30, 35 years. So, and at the end of that, you're left with two options. One is decommissioning, so removing everything, and that happens basically, it's the opposite of installing. I'll go through a few slides that show how these things are installed. So decommissioning is you reverse that, you remove everything, or repowering. Basically, you figure out, is there still life left in some of these structures? Does it make sense to just let them go? Which is probably the easiest thing. They still generate. So that's the typical question that pretty much any power plant asks itself at the end. So for onshore wind, it will be the same thing. Does it make sense to let them run, or do we remove everything? And I have a slide on that. We keep talking about this feasibility and development. What does it mean? What does it involve? A lot of stuff, a lot of questions. All these questions that you are raising are things that we have to ask ourselves, that government wants us to ask the people as well. So at the moment, we're in that early phase of just gathering information. And so, for example, gathering wind information, gathering the environmental information that we have on South Taranaki, doing a lot of work on what types of jobs these projects could bring, talking to the community, doing investigations on the electricity market to understand how the price from our wind farm would compare with the electricity prices, all those things. All that, we don't have the final answer on all that. There's a lot of work that goes into all that. And what that leads to is the first line that you see here, the feasibility license. So basically that is what we don't have at the moment because the government hasn't set it up yet. It's a license that tells us you're allowed to go out there in South Taranaki and start doing all these studies. For example, environmental studies. We will be looking at 2 or 3 years of studying marine mammals, seabirds, benthic environment, fish, all that. But that's expensive. It's a very expensive exercise.
But
so
very important.
absolutely. This project doesn't go anywhere without that done. But the thing is, unless there is a license behind it, we can't go out and do it. So that answers maybe part of your question. Why haven't we done it yet? It's because we don't have a license for it. We're starting to do some of those studies. Hello, if you want to, plenty of space. So environmental surveys are one of the things that we'll be running for a number of years. Wind monitoring, obviously. Then we would have to do all our engineering. We would have to do quite a bit of studies on the seabed to understand what the seabed looks like. And then just designing it, getting all the components, understanding who we're selling the electricity to. So these are all the other questions that we need to ask ourselves and get answered before we get to this line, which is the final investment decision. That's basically when we have all this information gathered over years and years of studies, and we decide, is there a commercial case here? Like if we build this thing, is it going to make money? And if the answer is no, this thing doesn't happen. Yep.
I mean, if we look at it now, Taranaki's never needed any other type of power. Why are we doing it now?
Because this is for New Zealand and Taranaki.
Outside, foreign company doing it when we could clearly have one of our own do it.
Not quite.
We may not have
Not quite, because no New Zealand company knows how to build an offshore wind farm. That's a problem.
I'm not saying build those, but
Yeah.
in a different way. But why do we need more energy? Is it to set up for the smart cities that are coming up?
That's one of the things. There's quite a few projections of why electricity will be more electricity will be required. One is electric vehicles. There's quite a few industries at the moment that are very polluting, and they could be less polluting if they changed to electricity. An example is the steel manufacturing. They use a lot of coal at the moment, and as a country, we're kind of agreeing that we don't want to use coal in the future. That means that they need to change their processes to electric, and that requires a lot more electricity than we're producing at the moment. So we're not saying that this is going to solve every electricity problem in New Zealand. It's one of the things that we should be looking at, together with onshore wind, solar farms, all that. So it's just one of the tools. Sorry.
Question. Is
Yep.
that TY point closed tomorrow?
Yep.
how do the calculations work then? Because you've got 13% of our production
Yep.
comes back onto the grid.
Yeah, you should ask that to every developer of renewable energy in the country, because it's one of the big things that we have to keep an eye on. Yeah, it's a big if. If that happens, yeah, there's a lot of electricity suddenly being put into the grid, and some of these projects will not be needed. So, yeah, the answer is like that. Well, it's not that they won't be needed. They will be needed at a later stage. The amount of electrification that we're looking at is way beyond what TY at the moment kind of freezes up. Hi, Carl.
Hi, how are you?
Oh, good, thanks.
Can I
Sorry.
say also
Yeah.
that we have 9 very, very, very old hydro dams on the Waikato River.
They didn't work for us in Gisborne though, did they?
No, what you asking? No, but you are asking why do we
There's no power.
need? I mean, those dams failed without electricity.
There's some power plants like Stratford that will be closing in the next few years.
The power plant in Stratford's closing.
I think it's 2026 it's due for decommissioning.
So where's the new power station going to be held?
Well, exactly. That's a question. We're talking about one of the possible power stations.
Closing that Stratford power
Watch
station
out for your
for
substation.
the last 40 years.
Yeah, I heard that as well.
Where's the
The gas
substation?
one at Stratford,
Actually,
Well,
to do maintenance work on it, they were closing it then.
mm,
It had a very short life.
yeah. Well,
So,
it might be running for a bit longer. Yeah.
so I have a question.
Yeah.
If, let's just say, with these wind farms go in,
Mm-hmm.
the more that goes in, are we saying that we are decreasing the electricity grids that we have out here, like the power stations?
We're saying that we're replacing that electricity that currently is being produced with fossil fuels with one that is produced with renewable energy. That's the whole idea, is that we're talking about a clean energy source that is supposed to replace the non-clean energy sources.
But electricity isn't clean energy, is it? It's pollution we can't see. It's not visible to the eye.
Electricity, if it's created with clean, like wind power or solar power, is emissions free. It doesn't emit anything in the.
See the amount of energy that comes off the power station, do we? I'll give an example. I
Yep.
live close to one.
Yep.
And the insects don't live in my house.
Ah, yeah.
So I'm just using that as an example, is that we can't see
Mm.
the amount of energy that is coming off that. So, static, whatever you want. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's why nobody wants to live near a substation. That's for sure. Like really close. There's probably.
First,
Sorry.
I'll be there before the power station actually came.
Ah, yeah. Health effects from electromagnetic, not my field, absolutely. Sorry about that. But again, we're full of these in Europe, and nobody seems to have any particular problems with that.
Environmentalist with you at the next meeting. It's about the environment.
The next meeting is led by our chief environmentalist, so for sure. I might skip through a few things because otherwise we'll never make it to the end. And there's a few slides that are more about. So how do you decide the layout? Because one of the questions is you have just a stretch of sea. Can you not just put them in a grid? And sometimes you see that the turbines are put in slightly weird patterns. The main reason is that there's a lot of factors that basically decide where each turbine goes. So we want to try and keep them as separate from each other as possible, because that way they don't kind of steal the wind from each other. But obviously the further away you put them, the longer the cable to connect them, and cables are really expensive. So there's a bit of a balance. Sorry?
What's the exclusion zone, the area of where you where you're planning to put all of these turbines?
The exclusion zone for trawlers or things like that.
They're going to have an exclusion zone?
For some things, anybody can, like you can go in with your boat. There's no issues with that. I think there's a small exclusion zone. Well, you can't try and get onto the turbine. That's not a good idea. But you can still sail through the wind farm without problems.
My question was, what is the area that it will take up?
Yeah, I think for the
area
yeah.
they're all going to be in?
Yeah, for the size that we're looking at, around 300 square kilometers.
Areas.
Yeah. 300 square kilometers. That's for the size of 1,000 megawatts that we are potentially considering. Yeah. And the exclusion zone around it. So 300
square meters. Square kilometres.
Yeah. That's
300 square kilometres.
that's the area that all these turbines would potentially be spread over.
You're still able to go in between them and fishing and
You are. One of the things that could be excluded is trawlers, though. Really difficult to have trawling happening through the wind farm. Yeah, but with your boat or recreational fishing, yeah, there's many examples of fine to go in. It doesn't become an area that nobody can ever go in again, because the turbines are just sitting there 2 kilometers apart. In the middle, there's just sea, and yeah, there's no restrictions.
Turbines, you've got your power cables.
Yeah.
I know when Kupe put
The pipeline.
their pipeline in,
Yep.
we had to do a 500 metre exclusion zone on either side.
Yeah.
So are you looking at a no anchoring along those lines?
Yeah, there will be no anchoring along those lines, yes. We are looking also at quite deep water, like most of the wind farm is in over 40 meters water depth. And, sorry? Oh yeah, that most of the wind farm is in quite deep water. And my understanding is that most recreational fishers would not necessarily go out there that much and would not anchor in 30, 40 meters water depth anyway. But yeah, there will be an exclusion to anchoring and to trawling probably, because you can't really have trawlers risking to snag onto the power cables. It wouldn't be good for them or for us. But going out there with your line, absolutely. There's no nothing. These are just, there's a big pole in the middle of the sea, and just don't bump into it, because it's gonna win.
So that's not going to be the actual design. That's just
This is just an example of how the design gets. Yeah, we don't have a layout. We're way away from that. One of the questions we get is, how do you actually measure the wind beforehand? Because we need to understand what the wind conditions are like. So in the past, it used to be that structure that you see there. It's called a met mast. Basically, you would build a big, meteorological mast. That's the name. And at the very top, it would have a wind measurement device, and that would be at the height of what we call the hub. It's basically the center of the blades. And that you have it out there for 1 or 2 years, and it measures the wind, and at the end you can tell, okay, there's the wind behaves like this. That was a very expensive exercise, because installing that thing in the middle of the sea, probably $50 million or something like that. Nowadays, amazing technology. We have these things which are floating lidars. It's the lidar is like a laser that looks upwards and measures and is able to understand wind speeds at various heights. And amazingly, we're able to put them on these buoys, and you can see that's when we launched the buoy in Port Taranaki a couple of months ago. This is the buoy being towed out towards South Taranaki, and it's now floating, I think it's 40 kilometers offshore, 11 kilometers south of the Kupe platform, roughly. So it's floating out there, it will float out there for a year, roughly, or 2, if we decide.
How high would that be? 3 meters, 2 meters?
How high?
Yeah.
Up above it's actually quite big. It's probably sitting, if it floats at that level, that's the height of a container, shall we say 4 meters above the water level? Yeah, exactly, yep. But it measures wind all the way up to 300 meters above sea level, and that's sort of where, high of where the tip of our blades would be. So that, after a year, will give us very detailed recordings of the wind speeds, and that allows us to tell if we had a turbine there, how much would it have produced. Does this make sense? Yeah. I'll jump on. Environment. I told you that I had a slide about it. So the question is, what kind of studies would we be doing for the environment? This is just a sample of the ones that we always have to do. But on top of that, there will be a lot more. So fish, seabirds, marine mammals. We know that we have to understand all this about South Taranaki to make the decision, is the building of an offshore wind farm the right thing to do? Or will it impact the environment too much? We don't have that answer yet. We think it makes sense to ask it, and the idea is to ask
I
it.
think we just get concerned because when foreigners do something, we end up with all the mammals on New Zealand.
We understand that. And
if we don't do it all of our land, we're going to have even more
Yep.
on our land.
yeah, so I realize that I come with a company name that has the word Copenhagen inside, and the whole idea is that we would like to convince you that we're trying to do things differently, even though we are a foreign company. So these are some of the studies, and what we really, and you'll hear a lot more about this in this next session coming up in a month. What we really want to do is understand what other studies we need to do, what things are more important for South Taranaki that we might not have had to do in Europe, for example. So we're working with iwi quite a bit. We're working with, Wild for Taranaki, the NGO, that is coordinating some community studies on sort of environmental studies. So we're trying to get together all these bits of information to understand what should we be looking at going ahead.
I was just asking, which iwi are you referring to?
Yep. The 4 of South Taranaki that we've been working with mostly, so Narauru, Ngāti Ruanui, Naruahine, and Taranaki iwi. Those are the main ones. Ngāti Ruanui blessed this space a week ago, and we've been talking to them for the last year and a half. All 4 of them, sort of, keep them.
And all that sort of stuff as well.
I mean, the idea is that, all 8 iwi of Taranaki technically are, we're speaking to all of them. I was meeting with Ngāti Mutunga a couple of weeks ago, but there's been a sort of agreement that the 4 iwi of South Taranaki are the first ones that we should be, the main ones that we should be speaking to, because this is your motu.
Okay, Ngāti Ruanui, Ngārauru, Taranaki Kapai.
Yep.
Ngaruhine.
Yep.
The proprietors of our land
Mhm.
are hapus, not the iwi.
Yep, absolutely.
Can you name any hapu in Ngaruhine that you've spoken with?
We haven't spoken to a hapu yet, and we were talking.
Half your field is going to be in Ngaruhine.
Sorry?
Half of your proposed field is.
Yeah, I agree that. We've been told that it makes sense to start with the iwi. I was talking to Te Aorangi a few weeks ago about how should we go about talking to hapu.
Ngaruhine,
Yeah.
proprietors are not the iwi.
Yeah, I understand.
Proprietors
They
are
are
the hapu.
Yeah. So we're very happy to start talking to hapu. I'm hoping that some of the hapu members show up at these sessions as well.
Earlier instead of later.
Sorry?
It should have been earlier instead of later.
I understand that. Yeah. We're trying to.
We can talk about.
they don't control, the people do.
Yeah. And we understand that, for example, Ngāti Ronui and Naruahine are very different in terms of.
These ones up here, they're all over the people.
Yeah. Look, in the end, we would like to speak to every single individual besides hapu, iwi, whānau. So there's only 2 of us. We're trying to do everything we can to be out there as much as possible.
Just to clarify as well,
Yeah.
is that as far as we're concerned, yes, that is the hapu that you deal with,
Mm-hmm.
but we as Tāmahoi, the original people of the
Mhm.
land, are standing to say that Ngāti Ruanui is a third-party interloper that has taken over and usurped the original people of the land. So we also saying to you that the hapu of Tāmahoi are willing to have the conversation with you.
Oh, okay, absolutely.
And just making it clear to you.
Yep, thank you very much.
Ngāti Ruanui do not speak for Tāmahoi.
Yep.
Kia ora.
Okay, thank you. Kia ora. And absolutely. We're very happy to come and talk to the hapu directly and to have a conversation like this. That's the plan. Yeah, thank you. And besides understanding the environment, and again, we will talk a lot more about this in a month's time, there's also an aspect of, how will we protect the environment. I would like to, I missed out on a bit. This is an example of the type of activity that we could do to reduce the impact on the environment if we were to install this. So one of the things that can be impactful is that installing these, I will talk about what the foundations look like, but it's basically a big steel cylinder installed into the seabed. That's quite a noisy process, and it can be impactful on marine mammals, so that's accepted. What we want to do is minimize that or make sure that it doesn't create any issues for the marine mammals that might be present. So number 1 study is understanding which marine mammals are there, and that will be years of monitoring. But then this is an example of technology that was developed to try and minimize that impact, and it's an air bubble curtain. Don't know if you can see how it works, but it's basically a big rubber hose that gets installed at the base around where the monopile is being installed. It has a lot of tiny holes, and you pump air through it, and it creates this curtain or bubbles. And that basically shields part of the sound from leaving the area. and it basically reduces the sound levels. And you can have as many of these as you want next to each other, well, concentrically, to reduce the noise even more. So is this a final solution? Not necessarily. Other things would be if you find out that there's a marine mammal, for example, that migrates through that area for 2 months a year, you do not build during those 2 months. So there's lots of things that we would be looking to do to make sure that we are minimizing. And again, if the final answer is there's nothing you can do to minimize, that project doesn't happen in that area. It's as simple as that.
So, well, because you've already had these out there for many years, in fact it was actually started in 1887, so it's been around for such a long time, there should be some studies already in regards to our environment.
Yep.
Why has it not been brought forward?
No, there's a lot. There's a lot of studies. So this next session will talk a lot about what has been done in other countries and how all these effects have been mitigated. But what we need to do is figure out how to do it here, because it's never been done in New Zealand. So that's where we need to take all the things that we know from other countries and add everything that we don't know from here, right? That's the idea.
At the moment, this is only a theory, isn't it? It is not factual, it's not...
Well, the air bubbles, that's proven that it reduces the sound.
Sorry, what was that?
This air bubble curtain, it's proven that it reduces the sound. So I guess the question that we have to ask is, does it reduce it enough for New Zealand marine mammals, right?
Very sensitive.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. So we have to figure out if it's effective. But there's also a question about, can offshore wind actually enhance the environment? Because it's not all doom and gloom. First of all, we're talking about one of the things that we have to do to combat climate change, which is create more renewable electricity. So let's sort of not forget that we're also doing this in order to save the world from climate change. And marine mammals will suffer a lot more from climate change than from the installation of an offshore wind farm. So there's a lot of work that we should not forget about that. But also, this is an example of something that, again, it's quite a new thing, so we normally don't talk too much about it because not enough scientific studies have been done. But it looks like once you plonk these structures in the water, they actually promote a lot of growth of marine life around them because they become like artificial reefs. So you go from this area where there's just seabed and not much happening to a structure that is now hosting barnacles and all that kind of stuff that then attracts fish, that then attracts seabirds. So there is an element there of you're actually improving the ecosystem, if that is what we decide an improvement is. Maybe we decide that South Taranaki should not have artificial reefs. Again, all questions that are open.
With those towers, is there a platform at the bottom on the seabed? If there is, what size? And the footing going down, how deep does the footing go?
That depends on the... So there isn't a platform at the bottom. The steel pile goes straight into the seabed. Normally around we will have some rocks installed, and those are for protecting against scour, basically avoiding that the current drags away all the sediment, and all of a sudden we find ourselves with a big hole and sediment all over the South Taranaki Bight. If you put some rocks on top, that normally stops it. How deep? That depends a lot on the soil conditions, and that leads me amazingly to this next slide, which is how do we understand the seabed conditions? So we need to do a lot of work to map the seabed to understand what it looks like underneath. Is it sand? Is it rock? Rock will be very bad, but we don't think that there is rock in the South Taranaki Bight from our initial studies. So it's mostly about understanding what the soil conditions are, and then you understand how deep this pole has to go into the seabed, basically. If it's really soft soil, it will have to go deeper in. If it's really competent soil, not that deep.
So
it can be...
Based on best guess at this stage, how deep are they looking?
Shall we say between 20 and 40 meters depth? Something like that? Yep. So going to seabed, what's the kind of disturbance that these things put on the seabed? So, and again, this comes from, we know what seabed mining was proposing. Seabed mining, very different treatment of the seabed from us, right? That was sort of dredging, is that the right word? Well, picking up a lot of pretty much seabed in a wide area. So even though the map that we show with the area of interest, that green area, and that's the Cooper platform polygon, that looks big, and I was saying 300 square kilometers, but the reality is that these turbines are really far apart from each other. So this is a bit what the structure looks like. The steel cylinder at the base can be 12 meters diameter, so it's pretty big, but the next one is 2 kilometers away. So I have what I think is a cool graph. Let me know if it makes any sense. But this is, if this was 300 square kilometers, the size of the poles that actually go into the seabed is actually that tiny. So it's only a very small component of those 300 square kilometers that has a structure installed in it, because they're so far apart from each other. In between, it's just untouched seabed. So it's very different from...
Combined area.
Sorry?
That little square, is that
Yeah.
combined area?
Yeah.
One you're talking about?
No, the combined area, yeah.
Could fit in that square?
Yes, so this is 300 square kilometers. All the 70, 12 meter diameter piles that we're talking about fit in that tiny square.
Does that include the cable?
Including the cable, yeah. The cable is really tiny. I think the corridor of the cable is like 2 meters wide or something like that, so it's pretty tiny. And this slightly larger square is that scour protection, so those rocks around the... Because if I go back to the previous image, you see that there's the pile and then this circle of rocks, and that can be sort of 40 meters diameter. So, you know.
So how many turbines are you looking at in your modelling at this stage?
For the size of projects that we're looking at is 70.
Oh, 70.
Yeah, yeah.
How many do you plan to put in?
That's, with the project that we are looking at the moment, that would require 70 turbines.
Have you forecasted in the future how many you plan?
That's the size of the project that we're looking at. Yeah.
Okay.
And what she's talking about is,
In the future.
once you guys get contract, are they going to see more and plan?
Each project would have to be...
Because the investment will be quite huge. They're going to want to make more because it's going to be a fast growing thing that everybody wants to get on.
Yeah.
A lot more investors. Next minute, New Zealand gone.
No, it's not going to go like that. These projects actually where everybody agrees that there's only so many that will be installed in New Zealand. There's probably space for 3 or 4 of these projects, not that much more. Because they generate so much electricity that we will not need a lot more than that. So, you know, at the moment we're looking at the 70 and we're not planning to put, I mean, if we went for another project for another 70, we would let you know and we would have another series of conversations like this.
So which country holds the most turbine farms that you've placed?
That we have placed?
China.
China is currently the one that has the most offshore wind farms, and the UK is the second one with most. Yeah, UK, yes. China and the UK are the 2 top developers of offshore wind farms so far.
They're also investors too, aren't they? China's one of our biggest. No, it's not.
Well, they're not investing in this.
They have part in this. They are a big part of this. Research is a big part. Fund is the other partner.
Yeah. I'll jump on to the question that was asked earlier. So, you know, about fishing. And again, so we started with an initial fisheries assessment that shows that in that area that we're looking at, it seems like there's not a lot of trawling happening. You might be able to tell me a bit more about that. But that's an initial, you know, good thing to know. Are we going out there and disturbing a lot of the trawling? But otherwise, like as I was saying, recreational fishing, by now, at the beginning of the industry, there was a bit more. We weren't quite sure if it was okay, but by now in Europe, pretty much it's open. In the US, you can go and fish inside offshore wind farms. So from that point of view, from a recreational point of view, no big deal. Trawlers, yes, that becomes a problem. So it would effectively become an exclusion zone for trawlers. So that leads to, you know, a lot of conversations in the next few years about how do fishermen who cannot go out there and trawl anymore get compensated. And that's what we're doing, for example, on our Australian project. There's a lot of work being done exactly on that sort of compensations.
In Australia, are you doing?
Sorry?
Whereabouts in Australia?
It's off the coast of Gippsland, south of Victoria.
Victoria.
Yeah. Yeah. And another question that was coming up earlier, so how will we work with local communities and iwi? Again, I said that earlier, so I'm hoping that this becomes a healthy, transparent conversation, and I'm here to say that we're trying to do that, and we hope that that you will trust us enough that we're trying to have all these conversations early on to start on the right foot. Questions and answers, all the questions that you're asking are absolutely legitimate and we want to hear them. We're not here to imagine what you want to hear. We will be eventually exploring also community benefits. These are big projects that normally, where communities gets get, for example, trusts set up, and developers will provide benefits. One of the things is there's no mechanism that works everywhere, so we will be discussing with the local communities what's the best thing that you would like. What is the thing that the community would want in exchange for hosting this project? Does it make sense? Last year or so, we've been talking quite a lot with iwi, and so as you were saying, the next step is moving to the hapu. And I understand that for Ngāruahine we should have started with the hapu. It's something that I learned a bit recently, so I wish I had known it a bit before.
Well,
but
you're right, because the hapus are the ones
Yep.
that they're the strong arm of the iwi.
Yep.
Iwi only can do whatever the hapu want them to do.
Yeah. It's I'm constantly learning about this world that is a bit new for me, but we're getting there, hopefully.
Just like going to the TRC for all your consents, when you know that for some of them, you've got to go to the STDC. It's no difference.
Yeah. We're not claiming that we know everything. We're here to ask questions as much as you are. So
we'll be happy to guide you through.
That's awesome.
At a kaitiaki level, to ensure that the customary and cultural side of what you're talking about are kept intact and with integrity. And when John talks about STDC and TRC, they again are a third party interloper.
Yep.
And we're saying to you that as the hapu of the land, the hapu people of the land, the consultation should always be with us in the first instance.
Kapai.
And then you go out.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, kapai. Thank you. And
question.
Yeah.
We have a lot of earthquakes here in Taranaki.
Yep.
So, and New Zealand sits on two tectonic plates.
Yep.
So, with all this drilling and all this, I think we had the kind of like a same discussion in my mind with the oil companies, and we're looking at putting in 7 here in Taranaki. It just bothers me that our maunga is due for a boom.
Yep.
It's only a matter of time. So
Calm down now, please.
have you, it's just facing reality. So have you guys looked at that?
Yeah.
Our maunga, the sensitivity of our maunga. We had a bit of a scare probably about 7 years ago. And it started smoking.
Yeah. It's a study that I want to have done. We're not there yet, but I think we want to study, because I think the last I heard was that there's a 50% probability of the maunga erupting in the next 50 years. I would like a study that shows us what the wind farm might do in that case.
The last went 27 kilometres southwest of Hawera.
Yeah. In terms of earthquake, these structures are actually quite good against earthquakes because they are really flexible, and their natural period, which is the time it takes them to flex from one side to the other.
More about what the work that you got to do this is going to affect that. Is it going to be of an effect?
Yeah, I can tell you, no, it won't be. I worked as a seismic engineer as well. I can tell you that the forces in play are completely different. So sticking a pole 20 meters and 40 meters in the earth doesn't feel it. So if there's an earthquake, it's going to happen regardless of us installing this.
Do you think the dredging that they're doing at the moment out there is doing anything to it as a seismic? This is obviously a little bit off topic, but I'm curious because it's in that exact area where that...
What dredging is that?
The ferrite, the one that they had to push through because it was a retrospective...
I can't talk about that project. I don't know enough to estimate.
In that same spot.
But I will go out on a limb and tell you that a 40 meters steel cylinder stuck in the earth, we're talking about tectonic plates that are probably 1 billion times more heavy, and so they're two completely different things. There won't be any effects from that, I can assure you.
Just another little question.
Sure.
We feel we're a bit like the Wild West here, because thank you for putting up this here. But do you have a relationship with Wind Quarries Zealandia and some of the other corporates busy sniffing around, not bothering to talk to the community first. And some of them have been doing it for 2 or 3 years ago. This is interesting. So, what feedback do you have?
Define relationship. We are Wind Quarry Zealandia, Blue Float. We're all competitors. We're all different companies looking at effectively the same thing. We think we are the first ones to reach out with this kind of forum, but it's not a race. We're doing our own thing. We think that it's important to reach out to hear your voices.
Somebody like Wakefield and do a behind the scene thing.
I don't know.
Straight up.
Not sure about
The
that.
company did. Well, they were starting the treat over here. They were on the other side here bringing in stuff and already starting stuff.
No, we thought, and opening this place in Hawera is because of that. We realized that we're based in Wellington, and for you, Wellington might not mean anything. It might mean maybe you feel like we're very disconnected, but we want to try and actually be here. And myself, my colleague Sarah, are here tonight to have these chats with you in the place where things could happen, right? And in 2 weeks' time, we'll be in Pattaya because there's also an important aspect for Pattaya. So we want to really reach out and at least start answering these questions as much as we can. Okay, so not sure how we're doing with time. How is everyone? Do you want a break and have a bit of food, or shall we plow on? Carry on. Okay, now we're getting into the engineering part. I hope I don't bore you to death. But so how are these things actually built, which I think is the exciting part. First of all, there's a bit of terminology there on the various parts. So the bit that sticks the turbine into the seabed is called the foundation. Then we have on top of that we have the tower. And on top of the tower, there's the nacelle, which is that big sort of square bit that holds all the components that turn. And then the blades are connected to the hub. So those are the sort of main parts. That's the offshore wind turbine. Then there's some extra bits that kind of complete the offshore wind farm. We saw some in the previous slide that I showed. The cables that connect the various turbines to each other. The offshore substation, and I will talk a bit more about that. And then when the electricity arrives on land, then we would have an onshore substation, and that's the structure that you see all over the place. Every power plant has an onshore substation. So from here on, it's kind of known territory. Everything else is a bit new for New Zealand.
Just a question.
Sure.
Okay, so you're 50-50 with New Zealand.
Yep.
You construct your 70 structures.
Mm-hmm.
Then what do? Do you offsell it to get a profit and then move on? Or do you stay on? What's in 60 years' time?
Yeah.
What will we be looking at?
Yes. In one thing that CIP normally does is, and we're one of the few developers to do it, is to start from the early development, this stuff, and build and then operate and hold on to the asset. After a number of years, it's impossible for me to tell you at that point it becomes commercial decisions on who owns the wind farm.
Well, so you won't be looking at selling it off to any of the big electrical corporates.
I cannot tell you that, but we're certainly not planning to. We're not. We're still talking about should we build this. We're not thinking about who shall we sell it to.
Tell me.
Yes.
There's a couple of things I need to know.
Yes.
And it goes back to, you said you had an exploratory wind test.
Yes.
It cost a lot of money.
It cost quite a bit, yes.
Did the companies, the two companies,
yep.
Look at the aspect that this just might not get off the ground and you have a recoverable in that operation, or you're hoping to steam through? Because the way I look at it, I bet you some of those turbines are being built for here as we speak.
What do you mean?
That's why they have one sections of the meeting.
We don't bring up all of this.
Yeah.
And then in 10 years' time you're going to put it in. They don't take overnight to build.
Aha. No, unfortunately, it's exactly like that. We're talking about it now with the hope that in 10 years' time we build it. It takes a lot of time and a lot of thinking to get to the point where we decide to actually build a thing like this. And again, if we're not satisfied, we're not building it because there's no point for us to do it. Yep.
We know how much what is building.
Does one of them? I could put a few houses on there.
Yeah.
How much does it cost to run one of those? I mean, we're looking at
how much is it going to take?
We're estimating.
That's the barge.
That's the whole structure to build it up.
Yeah.
Working barge.
That's why it's so big.
So the estimate that we have for building the whole offshore wind farm,
Well, how much does it cost to
Yeah.
run one of these
to
turbines?
to run or to build?
Or both.
To maintain.
To maintain it, yeah. Can I give you the numbers for the whole offshore wind farm? Because I don't have them down. We're estimating that building it will cost around $5 billion. Roughly like that.
The BlackRock's going to get
And
in
the whole,
too.
that's the whole thing.
Who's giving
The BlackRock thing, we have nothing to do with BlackRock. I know that the news of this place came up at the same time as the BlackRock announcement, but it's not to do with us. And to run to operate, yeah, it's costly that as well. But the thing is, we're talking about something that generates so much electricity that it makes sense, in some cases, to actually build something like this with that cost, because it just creates a lot more electricity than an onshore wind farm would.
So with that 5 bill, it will produce how much electricity are you thinking of?
1 gigawatt, 1,000 megawatts.
Okay.
Yeah, that's roughly what we're looking at the moment. Yep. So big numbers, but
Is that the whole 70 or just one?
the whole 70.
Alright.
Yeah, the whole thing. So it's a big number, but New Zealand super fund are pretty good investors. They keep winning awards worldwide for the best New Zealand, for the best superannuation fund. And my company, pretty good investors as well. So if they decide that those $5 billion are too much, we're not going to do this.
Is it 1 gigawatt annually?
1 gigawatt is the maximum.
Is that all it will make?
That's the maximum power that it can generate instantaneously.
Oh, yeah.
Over a year, we're looking at 4,500, if I remember correctly, gigawatt hours, which is another unit of measurement, which I was hoping to not have to explain because it's next level complicated. I don't think Monday evening is the right time to talk about gigawatt hours. Can I plow on? How are these connected to the seabed? So we were talking about foundations early. I've talked a lot about the monopile, the stick, and that's because pretty much I think it's 85% of all offshore wind farms built in the sea in the world have used that technology. Eugenie, we will be sharing. We can share all these slides later if you want.
Oh, that'll be awesome.
Yeah.
Let me take them photos.
We're also filming and recording all this, so all this will be available. Should probably have asked if everybody is okay with filming happening tonight.
Just film forward.
Okay. I think it's probably only me being filmed anyway, so perfect. So yeah, the monopile is the standard way of doing it, a big steel stick stuck in the ground. The thing is that the more you go into deeper water, the more you can imagine this becomes quite a flexible structure. And there's a point where you have this 260-meter stick that is just flopping around. That doesn't work anymore. So in deeper water, you start needing more stiff structures, and this starts looking a bit like what you have in oil and gas. So here you can go in deeper water. Very expensive to build those structures, though. So again, there's a bit of a balance of, can we go simple and does it still work or not? For South Taranaki, the kind of water depths that we're looking at would allow us to use monopiles, and that's the easiest way of doing it. When you start going really deep, then that's where you have the floating offshore wind farms. That's a bit of a new thing. There are a few concepts out there that work really well. You would never think that you could make one of those things float, but they do. The problem is that there's a lot of work to get them to commercialization, as in being able to build 100 of those and put them in the sea. There's a bit of a step change needed there. Hiya.
How many years to recover that 5 billion from this project?
Yeah, normally offshore wind projects like this pay themselves in less than 10 years. And then you're left with the other 20 years of profit. That's absolutely rough number. It's different case by case, but that's one of the metrics that investors like NZ Super would be looking at, like how long before we get our money back, basically.
A range of the current projects are underway right now. Their estimates are going up like that.
That's
like that.
Yeah, that's quite true of energy projects all over the world. To be honest, of projects in general, COVID and then Ukraine, all that has been pushing costs of pretty much everything up. So in a way, we're kind of quite happy that we're looking at a project that might happen a few years away, because we might have, we might be riding out all that wave of crazy expensive everything that's happening at the moment. So from that point of view, it's probably a blessing. Components, we talked about the size of components for this kind of stuff. I think that top left picture is probably one of the ones that tells the story. Can you see the people? So that blades are starting to be, for the turbines that we would be looking at, are 110 meters long. So
are they manufactured here, all the components?
No, not New Zealand or Australia. Very few countries have the capacity to build this kind of stuff. Could we? Yeah, we could. We could build factories to build this kind of stuff. But yeah, the costs there are big. They would be shipped over, yes. For these main components, yes. There's a lot that can be still manufactured locally. It's a matter of discussing. I mean, Australia is trying to figure out if they have enough of a pipeline of projects being proposed that it would make sense to build a factory that builds these. These are all commercial decisions of, like, if we build a factory, will we manufacture enough blades to make back the investment? It's any business would.
Just looking at those new components, go to the other end 35 years, you're confident that they can be recycled, but if they can't, is there going to be a sinking fund created to look at decommissioning in 35 years? And if that happened, who would hold that then? Because some of us are the ones left holding the baby just around the coast.
Know well about Tamarin.
Tax dollars going into it, bailing out offshore corporates.
Shall we say the New Zealand government didn't have a very long sight on that issue? Offshore wind.
Just saying that's a question that as a community will be putting up quite early in all of these projects. Is there a sinking fund for the decommissioning project?
Yeah, a decommissioning bond or something like that. So the offshore wind industry, because it was born out of the oil and gas industry in Europe, by that point, oil and gas projects in Europe, everybody kind of had figured out that, you do need that kind of mechanism to hold developers accountable for the decommissioning. So that transitioned quite easily into offshore wind, i.e. every offshore wind project that gets built around the world has a solid decommissioning strategy out of it. And then normally it's decommissioning bonds that get set up so that you're contributing to this fund. So if at the end the developer, for whatever reason, is not there anymore, the money is there to do the decommissioning. So no TUI field, situations or anything like that.
Because the ones who had to bail them out in the end was us as taxpayers.
Yeah. I'm a taxpayer as well, and I don't want to be doing that. So 100%. So MB, the government agency that is currently looking into setting up the regulations for offshore wind, are consulting on just that at the moment. So what kind of guarantees should decommissioning?
So who are they consulting with?
Well, they just put out a discussion paper that is freely downloadable online, and you can go out there and.
It's an MB discussion, not MEP.
MB. Yeah. It's called Developing a Regulatory Environment for Offshore Renewables, or something like that. And anyone can go and write there what they think. It's a really well done document, explained really well. So I would, not a bedtime read, but something like that. Should we talk about ports a little bit? So, as you can imagine, all those big components have to arrive from the factories where they get produced, and normally they would be marshaled in a port in the country where they then get installed. Marshaled means basically just a space where you receive them all and you store them there until they go out on a ship like this to be installed. Top left there is the largest offshore wind construction port in the world, Esbjerg in Denmark. That used to be a sleepy tiny port until they realized in the late 90s that, we could dedicate a bit more space to these blades, and now they are enormous and they bring a crazy amount of wealth to the area.
Port would you be looking at?
So Port Taranaki in New Plymouth is the only deep water port on the west coast, and effectively the closest one to the area of South Taranaki. So is Port Taranaki ready to host that amount of stuff? No port anywhere in the world is ever ready for the scale of offshore wind projects. So one of the things that we're always fairly sure we'll have to do is contribute to upgrading ports. So that's an example of the kind of thing that, again, it requires its own conversation about should we do it, what does it mean in terms of impact on the port. So it's what we call enabling infrastructure. So it's not something that we build directly, but it's something that we need built in order to build an offshore wind farm. So big conversations there.
So part of your 5 billion doesn't include, say, 0.7 mil to assist developing there.
Not that much, but it would require some contribution to a development of a port. Yeah. But again, then it goes all to the question of, right now, again, there's no laws that tell us that we can do this. So we're certainly not going to go and give $100 million to the port to redevelop because we don't know if we're going to do this. How do I justify it to the investors that we're asking for that? So there's a question around who helps pay for stuff like that at the beginning. Yep. So that's the construction port. The other type of port is operations and maintenance. So once the wind farm is in place, you actually have to have crews that go out and visit the turbines regularly. Normally each turbine wants to be visited once a year for maintenance. We have 70 of them, and as you probably know, the weather in South Taranaki Bight is pretty nasty. You're not getting out every day. So, between the days that you cannot actually access, you have a crew that is always on standby, going out, in and out. So there would be, for example, for a 1 gigawatt wind farm, we will probably have 3 crew transfer vessels, these 12 people vessels, that would sit somewhere, and the somewhere, that's the big question. The thing with operations and maintenance is you would like that harbor to be as close to the wind farm as possible, and that's why there's been a lot of talk about Pattaya. So, when I started working on this project a year and a half ago, I had recently driven through Pattaya, and a friend who was with me told me the story about the freezing works and how Pattaya used to be a commercial port. So I was like, well, if it had that history in the past, it could have something like that in the future as well. So there is the possibility of having the operations and maintenance port harbor in Pattaya. It doesn't require super deep water. I know that the Pattaya sandbar at the entrance is nasty. I have probably 20 videos on my phone. Every time I drive past there, I take the same video of the sandbar. But that's a possibility, and that's just something that, again, we're looking to understand. Is it the type of project that a community there would want? Does it make sense? From a technical point of view, we just we had our experts look at the bathymetry of the river, and it looks like we would be able to have these vessels going in and out. So that's the first piece of the puzzle that we need to understand if it makes sense from our commercial point of view. The other option would be to have operations and maintenance run out of New Plymouth again. And that would mean a much larger ship that works also as an accommodation ship. So that would be going out of Port Taranaki every couple of weeks and then floating at the wind farm for, say, 2 weeks. And then the crews will be taken to the various turbines from there, and then it goes back. That's another strategy of doing it. It's a bit more expensive. We would rather have people going in and out of Pattaya. But again, very early days. This is an opportunity that we need to discuss. I will run out of voice soon, but we'll try. Yes?
Just in regards to your offshore vessels,
Yeah.
are you going to have to build how many of those?
A vessel like this, there's only a few in the world. There's not that many. It's a very specialized vessel. I always like to wow audiences saying, do you know how much the rent for one of these is per day? It's roughly $500,000. Oh. So
you don't want one of those.
there's not many alternatives, unfortunately. And when I said $5 billion, it's because it's made up of a lot of these costs. The minute that you do something offshore in the marine environment, everything is expensive because it's a difficult environment to build things in. And personally, I think it's awesome that us humans have managed to do things like that. It's in some ways projects like this is like going on the moon. So vessels like this, there's not that much choice, to be honest. There's a few in the world. You have to book them years in advance to make sure that they're ready for your project. So we wouldn't be building one. We would be getting one, hiring one from overseas. Yeah. For the crew transfer vessels, the ones that go out to service the service the offshore wind farm, that's something that normally gets built locally because it's a smaller ship. It's like a 12 people mover. So that's the kind of thing that we could have built here. And they could be built to the specifics of, for example, Pattaya, if Pattaya was, the harbour that was selected. Okay, what does a monopile look like? How do you build one? This is, again, the foundation, the big steel stick that goes into the seabed. It starts off as just steel plates. I would not be the guy standing there, to be honest, under that thing. It's probably like, I don't know, 20 tons. Then that plate gets rolled through a really cool machine that turns it into a circle, and then that gets welded up, and that forms one can, and then you attach a lot of cans together, and you get a 2,000-ton big piece of steel. I was in a yard next to one of these, and I have a picture. I should actually bring it up of my hand next to the thickness of the steel there, and I think it was the whole. So it's that thickness of steel.
Just looking at the size of it.
Yep.
In looking at your blades, your blades are 110, so your diameter is 220.
Yep.
So that means you're 40 meters off the sea. Now, some of these hurricanes that we've had recently had some pretty interesting wind speeds. And some of those wind speeds encourage up to a 30 metre swell. Now, with some of these hurricanes getting more adventurous, so it only leaves you another 10 metres before it's slapping your blades, isn't it?
Normally the bottom of the blade would probably be around 35 meters off the sea level. I think highest waves recorded here, if I remember correctly, are 16 meters wave height. That means 8 meters crest and 8 meters trough, right? So that's kind of from 8 meters.
30 metre top, yeah.
So 8 meters above the sea level is where the wave crest would be. Then you have to consider also the slamming effect of the wave slamming into the structure. All that stuff gets designed very well. My very first job as a structural engineer in London was exactly doing that, calculating what the height of we call it the interface, basically where the monopile becomes the tower, where it has to be based on the wave conditions of the area.
For example, that last storm that hit us over the east coast that year,
yep.
That was far more rugged than the one that we had about 20 years ago. So
Yeah. Storms are becoming way worse. So these things have to be designed. These things have to be designed for all those conditions, and there's a lot of engineering that goes into it. I can assure you. Yeah. How do you move around that 2,000-ton thing? That's coming out of the factory. You can have a big vessel like this with a big crane, although not many vessels out there can lift 2,000 tons. 2,000 tons is a lot. Otherwise, I always find this amazing. You can actually float these things. So if you seal the two ends, it just becomes like a big boat. So you can just float it to side, remove one of the plugs, and install it. It's pretty cool.
That's how they did Maui, wasn't it?
Yeah. All this stuff, it's all knowledge that comes from the offshore oil and gas world. Oil and gas, because there was money thrown at those projects, they solved every engineering issue ever. So we're kind of living off that quite a bit, because a lot of those solutions work for offshore wind as well. So we don't have to reinvent too much. What you see here is the hydraulic hammer that installs the monopile. So it's sitting on top of the monopile, you see. And in there's a mass similar to what gets done onshore when you're piling. There's a mass that gets lifted and dropped several times so that slowly drives the monopile into place.
So footing is just solely the pile getting driven down.
Yeah.
There's nothing else.
No, it's like a nail. Yep. It's like a nail stuck into a board. I don't know if it has hydraulic oil. Probably. Shall we say probably? Not mechanical engineer, but yeah.
Leaking in the sea, though.
But yeah, we would not want it leaking. If it's leaking in the sea, it's bad. There's an issue.
That would be that's only a part of the annual maintenance.
No, this gets done once at the beginning when you install it, then never again. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. This happens at the beginning and then never again in the history of the offshore wind farm. Thanks, Carl. Okay, we got to the point where we have the monopile installed. It's sticking out of the water a couple of meters normally. And now what we put on top of it is a transition piece, which is that yellow thing. So you see the monopile here sticking out of the water. Why do we need to stick this other bit on top? Mainly because this is the steel cylinder that holds the ladders to access the external platforms and a lot of other of these sort of smaller appendages that we need on it. Why can we not install all that on the monopile? Simply because that driving process is way energetic. Everything would fall off. So we need to access. And it's already 7 p.m. Everybody okay for me to carry on? Okay, great. And so yeah, sorry, I missed out on the last bit. So once that is installed, you now have, up there's a big flange, and that's where you then connect the turbine, the tower of the turbine. So that becomes that interface elevation that I was talking about earlier. So that's the bit that you certainly want way above the waves. You don't want the waves hitting that external platform. As I was mentioning at the very beginning, so all those cables that run in between the turbines converge into something that looks like this. This was designed by the company I used to work for before joining this job, so I'd like to point it out. What this does is basically it hosts, the main thing that it hosts is the transformers. So the electricity comes in from the various turbines at 66 kilovolts, if it means anything to anyone, and then normally it gets transformed up to 240 or 300 in order to be sent to shore. The reason for
the main one that all of the turbines power goes to.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. All the turbines converge into this one, and then from here we have one or two big cables that go to shore, and that way. That's a way to do it to minimize the losses, the electrical losses in the cables. If you had the cables all going from the turbines to land, you would basically lose a lot of electricity along the way. That's a simple way of explaining it. So this allows to keep most of the electricity reaching land efficiently. Picture of what one of these subsea cables looks like. Big spool, you can see. So there's a ship that is equipped with a big spool, and it basically, the ship goes and it lays the cable behind it. Pretty cool. This is what we were talking about earlier, the potentially, that's a machine that digs a trench. It's normally a couple of meters deep, and the cable gets laid inside, and then the seabed covers it again. We're not saying that we will use that. It's one of the things that you can use if you decide that that's the best way to protect the cables.
Would you use a rock mat on top?
Yeah, that's also a possibility. Yeah, that the rock mats, especially if you have very mobile seabeds like South Taranaki seems to have, that could probably be a good solution.
Yeah, because with the Kupe one coming in, there's a rock mat. On that.
Kupe has a pipeline though. It's a bigger pipeline. This export cable is something like this big. It's not huge.
What size?
Something like that, I think. The export cable. The array cables are even smaller. We were vaguely hoping, where we set up this place, we wanted to have a few props, and we were hoping to get a cross section of a cable. But yeah, it's not very easy to find. We had sent a few emails around, and nobody can. If you know anyone who has a spare cross section, let me know, please.
Would it be similar to the likes of fibre optic cable for internet stuff?
Kind of. I think this is a fibre optic cable, so it's not.
Underwater.
Yeah. Although I think underwater fiber optic cables are really tiny. They might have some armor around it. But yeah, these are the 3 phases of the conductor, and that I think is fiber optic, and I think there's also like internet stuff. Again, not my expertise. We talked a bit about the installation vessels. This is building one of our wind farms in Germany, which you see. A lot of these pictures are of that German wind farm that we built a few years ago. And this is actually building that wind farm. So you can see that it lifts itself, it's a jack-up vessel, so the vessel lifts itself out of the water in order to become a solid platform to install the turbines. And now, the thing that you were all waiting for, I have a video that shows how these things are actually installed. Everybody ready for a video? Yes, you are. I'll do a bit of voiceover commentary. But this is our offshore wind farm, Veiamate. You can see that there's components coming from various countries because that was just the way to do it. So that was 67 turbines. And at the time, the monopiles that we used were the biggest in the world. I think another project took the record off us, fortunately. This is the vessel that is laying that scour protection rocks that we were talking about. So they drop them on the seabed before the monopile goes in. So you form this circle of maybe 40 meters diameter of rocks, and that will avoid that there's too much sand getting watered away. These are the turbines being manufactured, coming out of the factory.
How long will it take to erect all these?
To install them? To install them out there, we're looking at a couple of years probably. And considering the weather not always being conducive to this kind of operation.
What about for one?
The monopile installation and transition piece can be a few days, 3 or 4 days. The turbine itself goes up in a day, in 24 hours.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
3 or 4 days work and you can have it in there with the weather.
Normally the foundations get installed potentially even a year earlier, and then you come and do the wind turbines because the vessels are different. You don't have a vessel that does everything. Well, you have some, but they're probably even more expensive than this guy. So here the vessel has arrived, I think, at the installation place. Yeah, the monopiles get lifted up or appended. Then see it gets put in the sea. That's the air curtain air bubble curtain. And then it gets put on the seabed, and that's the hydraulic hammer, that white and red, so that you cannot see anything, but there's this mass being dropped, and so that thing is slowly going in. It's really difficult to actually see it go. But
do they just use ROV to monitor it?
Yeah. You see that over time, and that's what you end up with, the monopile sticking out of the water. You put that really cool tool on top, and that basically is made to measure, to make sure that the flange is completely flat. Obviously you don't want to, that's when you want to find out if your monopile is before you put the turbine on, right? And then you just put a kind of cap on top, and it stays there waiting for the transition piece to arrive. And that's the next step. So then the ship goes back to the port, picks up the transition piece. I was showing this to a friend the other day who noticed that you might see it later, but there is degrees on each transition piece. It says where, that one. So that means, because you need to install these in a very specific direction, you want the ladder to be facing away from most of the waves in order for the crews to easily access you don't want the waves coming from the side while the crew is trying to step on. If we manage to have that calm sea in South Taranaki, we will be very happy.
So how big were those transition poles again?
In terms of height, could be maybe 40 meters, something like that. Those are, the big bolts that hold together the transition piece, and we had one manufactured there. We had to have that manufactured by Quirk Engineering here in Hawara, because there's no bolts that size in New Zealand commercially available. If you want to try and lift it later, and brace yourself. Cool, so that was the foundation. And then another short video that shows the wind turbine going on. So at this point we have the transition piece, we have the flange, and you can see there, this is the foundation. This is a different wind farm, so this is a different type of structure. But that's the transition piece waiting for the tower to go on. So you see the vessel is getting ready to lift itself out of the sea. Bonk.
It's amazing.
Yeah, pretty cool. So this is the part that takes 24 hours. Getting there, everything is designed to be as quick as possible. Because again, expensive, this thing.
So they would work around the clock?
Yeah, it's 24-hour operations.
How much does it cost to get it to New Zealand? do a couple of wind farms at once?
Well, it's like the taxi. It starts clocking as soon as it leaves the port. So, yeah, us being here doesn't exactly help with those dynamics. But so the tower is now installed. It's installing the nacelle, so that the part that holds the machinery. Don't know why they decided to zoom out right at that time, but
Oh, and I thought those were UFOs.
might be.
Is that what they were?
And then it puts up, it's lifting the first blade.
Oh, good.
So it will connect the first blade, and then the rotor turns to prepare for the next blade to come in. So you'll see that, so it goes up. Now the next blade goes up. This is the same as onshore, just onshore wind gets installed the same way. Some companies are trying to install the whole rotor plus 3 blades on the ship, have it horizontal, and then lift the whole thing and plonk it on. If you can, that's another way of doing it. So that's it, easy. If you have the tools, right? Okay, I think I'm 3 slides from the end, so we're doing great. Just, engineering design. Again, I used to design them, so I had to have a slide about how they're designed. So they are designed to survive the biggest waves that we can have, the biggest currents, hurricanes. They are designed for hurricanes. Although in the southern...
What's your highest wave that's designed for?
I'll tell you the first offshore wind farm that I designed was designed for a 16.5 meter wave. And that was the maximum that was expected.
That's a little puff.
No, 16.5 is pretty big. It's similar to the maximum recorded in South Taranaki, my understanding. But we would do a decent study of what the worst conditions are and make sure to add a good safety factor for sure. The conditions in South Taranaki are not too different from the North Sea in terms of extremes, but they are very different in terms of wave periods. Because in the North Sea, in Europe, the waves are created by wind blowing over short bits of sea. So that means they get very big but very short, quite close to each other. Whereas here, we have the whole Southern Ocean that the wind can blow on. So by the time they get here, they are big and very long. And that will be a bit of a new challenge. Obviously they are like springs. So these structures need to be designed a lot in terms of making sure that they're not too flexible, that they're stiff enough to do their job. So how are the structures maintained, which was the question we were talking about earlier. They do require maintenance, but again, they're designed to try and minimize the maintenance because every trip out there is quite expensive. It can be dangerous. You're still working at sea. So we want to make sure that there's as few trips to the turbines as possible. There is a list of all the types of jobs that are required to maintain. And the good thing here is that there is a lot of overlap between offshore oil and gas jobs or just energy jobs and these types of jobs. So in Europe, it's been quite the case that there were these, and that we go back to talking about Patia, for example, South Taranaki, there was these sort of small, sleepy fishing villages that just happened to be right in the place where the wind farm could be built, and they became the operations and maintenance kind of centers. And also they became the catalyst for all these jobs that were required to go out and service a wind farm. So, we need, besides the technicians who actually do the work, we need the pilot of the boat that goes out, and that pilot will probably have a co-pilot, and then there will be a warehouse back on land where the things get stored, and then there's a harbor master, and then those are just the direct jobs. We're looking at potentially having also a helicopter needing to travel to there, so all of a sudden you have a helideck and you have the warehouse for the helicopter, and all these people need accommodation somewhere, and they need to go to Foursquare and buy more food. So you see that and that's why I was saying earlier that compared to onshore wind, these things just generate a lot more opportunities for jobs, especially in the operations and maintenance phase, because it's jobs that we can start.
Just looking at, the new Plymouth versus Patia.
Yep.
I know when they did the initial designs for Maui, even Kupe.
Yep.
They looked at Patia. They also looked at here down at Oahu.
Yep.
And they also looked at Pukanaki.
Yep.
So they did a range of scenarios and
I was talking to the Taranaki Andy Whitehead at the Taranaki Coastal, and he was talking about, why don't you do it in Opunake instead of Pattaya? So it's like, well, we'll investigate all these opportunities and see where something like this could be. It's not going to be the only one. If there's more than one offshore wind farm, there could be multiple harbors. But this is more to say, offshore wind does bring a lot of jobs. One thing that we need to make sure is that we start looking at these types of jobs early on so that they can be accessed by the local communities. Because the reality is, if we don't do anything, by the time we get to operate, we will have to have external people come in. But what we're trying to do is to talk a lot about what types of jobs come, understand what energy skills are already existing in the region, so that we can start preparing people for jobs like this. So we're doing a lot of thinking with, for example, the Polytech, with WIT, on what kind of training opportunities should we set up to enable people to go for these jobs when the time comes. So
thought about suggesting to WIT to bring some of that to South Taranaki, because at the moment it's hairdressing. I left the poster for this at WIT next door the other day, because the hope would be that polytechs like that or those training get set up locally. There's a point where us as developers, we can only do so much. It's not up to us to set up WIT in Hauera. So we can be the facilitators that explain what kind of opportunity there is. We will need these jobs, and then there's a point where it's local government that needs to step in, and But we're very happy to have these conversations with them.
With the projects out in Plymouth, that's what they set up training. Schools up there for them, and had to be certified as welders, and all their qualifications.
One thing that we could do is send some people over to Europe on our project and learn how things work there, and then come back. I mean, no, that's not a biggie.
Set it up here in South Taranaki, and then there'll be a lot more
awesome. So this is what I was talking about. So Pattaya, if we're looking at operations and maintenance, Pattaya is just in the right place to serve that kind of generic area. I think our studies showed that they would be able to get to the core of the wind farm in, say, I think an hour and a half sail from Pattaya. That means that 1.5 coming back is 3 hours a day. In a 12-hour day, you're stealing a bit of time, but not too bad. We looked into Wanganui as well. That starts being a 3-hour trip. And 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon, all of a sudden you're eating into the workday quite a bit. So that's a case where having the harbor close to the wind farm is a big plus. And we know that we would have to basically build new wharves and everything in Pattaya, so there's a big expenditure there. But if it then cuts costs in terms of it's much easier to get to the wind farm, there's a balance there that could make sense.
You probably be able to utilise Pattaya during the course of that whole operation for 35 years, because if it's there. So Pattaya could be.
Back in the days when it was
boom
again, eh?
Again? It would probably require some dredging to keep that bar doable. But okay, last slide, which is obviously what happens at the end, and we kind of talked about it a little bit. So offshore wind is quite a new industry. There's not many. There hasn't been that many offshore wind farms actually decommissioned, only 1 or 2. But technically, the way to do it is just the opposite of the installation that we talked about. So you take the blades off, you take the nacelle off, you take the tower off, and you remove the structure, and there's nothing left. Up until recently, so steel, very easy to recycle. All the steel parts are easily recycled. Up until recently, the blades were the sticky point, because there was no easy way of recycling. But just this year, both Vestas and Siemens, which are the 2 biggest wind turbine manufacturers in the world, basically showed that they have figured out a way of melting the resin that keeps the fiberglass together. And that allows that fiberglass to be reused for something else. So now the blades are becoming recyclable as well. And that was the last piece of the puzzle that needed sorting, to make sure that these things are actually sustainable. Because we're talking about an industry that is trying to be sustainable, and something that ends up having to landfill, blades sent to landfill, not good. So, but it's not like everybody was ignoring it. They've been working on it, and they figured out a way of recycling that as well. So that's the good news.
So we can expect that there'd be no debris left in the
So the big question is that monopile, the steel bit that gets installed. Normally the way it's been done so far is that it gets cut with some laser a couple of meters below the seabed, and then the whole top part gets removed. You are left with this steel bit stuck in the seabed under the seabed, or you wouldn't see it, but you would know it's there. Now we've heard that that could be something that is maybe not optimal. And they are, I think in Germany, there's a university that is devising a huge tool that I think vibrates the pile out of the seabed. So that's ongoing, studies.
So we might know within the next 10 years.
Yeah.
If it's viable.
Yeah. It's one of those things that gets one of those technologies that gets developed when someone decides that it's needed, I guess.
So that's sort of reverse liquefaction then,
yeah, sort of, yeah, good point. And actually, I showed the hydraulic hammer way of installing, which is this big mass. There's actually the same concept that they're trying to find if there's a way to vibrate the pile so that it goes down. And that apparently generates lower sound levels than the banging. So all these questions that you have, a lot of people have asked them, and the industry has been trying to solve them, because in many cases it can make or break whether the project goes ahead. If the only thing that is preventing a project from going ahead is too noisy, I can assure you that people will try and figure out a way to not make it as noisy. If that makes sense.
What that machine is called that they've been working on?
I think it's a vibro hammer, the one to install. The one to remove is probably a reverse hydro hammer. what's the reverse of the hammer? Yes.
In the past, Jack, there has been times when they've actually caught on fire.
Yes, they have.
What is the... so how have the people dealt with that or maintained that?
Yeah.
Is that a possibility that could happen with some of these ones that are going to be put in?
I think it's mostly happened onshore. I don't know of any offshore wind turbines but that's the reason. I have to be transparent on that. The reason is that there's a lot of onshore wind turbines. There's tens of thousands and only hundreds of offshore wind, thousands of offshore wind. So statistically, the onshore wind turbines have had more chances of catching on fire. It can happen. It's an industrial thing with bits that turn. Things can catch on fire. It doesn't do any good to anyone. So we certainly want to make sure that the maintenance is as good as it can be to avoid incidents. But there's only so much that you can try and be as perfect as you can. But things sometimes will happen.
I'm just thinking that we're on the ring of fire.
Yep.
And so I'm sure, just even the consideration of the imploding of, you see, and causing the fire, that's just something that's come to me as you were talking.
We're hoping that there wouldn't be too much fire around our turbines, so we put it that way.
Have they thought of have they envisaged a place where they might build the onshore
substation?
The substation?
Yeah, good question. Not yet. That's one of the bits of the puzzle that we haven't tackled yet. We have a study that we will run soon that will look at what's the best place to have those two cables that comes from offshore. Where should they land? Also because, as you know, like the coastline here is quite diverse. There's a big cliffs and stuff like that. So we have to figure out what's the best place to get our cable to land. And then from there we have to figure out what's the best route to connecting to the onshore transmission lines. So those are other bits that we need to sort out. But we haven't solved it yet. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. And if you have any more questions, I think we have contact details on the brochures. And in a month's time, we will be having another session here. Same thing. It will not be me speaking. You'll be glad to know. And it will be all about environment. So it will be our environmental specialist, fielding all your questions.
Just heads up on the environment. An area that we're quite concerned about is the effect on cetacean. And also your 220 or 300 square kilometre zone that you're envisaging. Does that intersect on the current environment of the blue whale and some of those other cetaceous species?
So we had an initial, it's called Environmental Technical Working Group, basically a bunch of New Zealand experts that looked at all the information that is already available in the South Taranaki Bight, putting that all together. The next step is actually going out and measuring some of this stuff, because there's a lot of uncertainty about, for example, which cetaceans use the area. So one thing that we're planning to do in the next few months is install a few hydrophones, so the microphones underwater. They're just like a probe that sits there and listens around for marine mammal presence. So it's not the kind of study that we will do so early in the project because it's pretty expensive, but we're hearing that that's going to be an important thing to understand which marine mammals are present, how they use the area. So we'll be starting to do some of that monitoring to just listen to what's going through the area. Yep. Bye. Thank you very much.